Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblett, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings magazine at the U.S. Naval Institute. Today is Monday, December 19th, 2022, coming to you from Annapolis, from the broadcast center here at the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center at the Naval Institute. Good to have you on board, everybody, today. This episode is brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield Dental Coverage. I can't help myself from smiling right now. That's because I have Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP Dental. I pay no deductible for in-network services. My in-network preventive care is fully covered, including 3 cleanings a year. Plans start as low as $20 a month. Learn more at bcbsfepdental.com. Okay, let's kick off the show. So last week we had our first Coast Guard guest in quite a while. Rear Admiral Doug Fears, fantastic guest. It was a great show. If you haven't watched that episode or tuned into it yet, I highly recommend it. And this week we've got our first foreign Navy guests. So joining me today from Germany are Captain Sascha Rackwitz and Commander Mark Baumert of the German Navy. So Mark's joining us from Wilhelmshaven. We were just joking before we kicked off that in 1988, Ensign Bill Hamblett got to visit Wilhelmshaven, a wonderful port. I had one of the best meals of my life in the Officers Club there at the Wilhelmshaven Naval Base, but I did joke that I'd been at sea for about 70 days. So, almost anything could have tasted really good. And Sascha Rackwitz, Captain Rackwitz, is joining us from Berlin. They are the authors of an article in the December issue of Proceedings. It's titled, NATO Navies Must Get the Balance Right. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Or I should say, willkommen in der Show. Good to have you.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay. And thanks for having us, Bill.
So good to have you. So before we get to a discussion about the article, if you could please give our listeners a little bit about your careers. What do you do in the German Navy? What are your specialties and what are your current job titles? Start with Captain Rackwitz.
Yeah, sure. I joined the Navy back in 1991, so shortly after you visited Wilhelmshaven. After university degree in history, in my case, I joined the submarine service. I have been a submariner ever since, interspersed by one or the other tours in higher command and the Ministry of Defense. I've been the skipper of a German U-boat, so a Type 206 class boat back in the good old days. I've been force commander of the German submarine force from 11 to 13, and chief of staff of the flotilla to which the submarine squadron belongs as well, which is in Kiel and in charge of all the assets in the Baltic Sea. In the meantime, I did several tours of the Ministry of Defense, mostly in Pol Mill affairs, spent 2.5 years in Brussels as a policy advisor to the German ambassador in the European Council. And currently I'm serving again in the MOD, that's why I'm in Berlin, as the XO to the Director General for Forces Policy. So my boss, a Army 3-star, he's in charge of force preparation, readiness, and enablement of the armed forces in the Joint Staff, and I'm his senior XO.
Got it. Thanks, Sascha. Mark.
Yes, well, my career is much less impressive, I would say. I started also a little bit later in 2004, joining the German Navy. Most of my time at sea, I was operations officer in the German Navy, as well as an exchange officer in the French Navy. Now currently I'm serving as an executive officer on board of a German frigate. Our main focus is anti-submarine warfare. I had some opportunities to work in the Ministry of Defense as well as NATO. My last post was a strategic defense planner in NATO. That was quite amazing to see how the strategic level and the operational level come together, meeting the tactical level at one point. So that was my career, more or less. So now XO on board of a frigate in Wilhelmshaven.
Fantastic. All right. So the article is titled "NATO Navies Must Get the Balance Right." Can you briefly describe the factors that you think need to be balanced? I'll start with Captain Rackwitz.
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, it's the very same factors which have caused headaches to naval planners since the times of Pericles, I guess. So there's, for one, finance, and obviously there's a strong history of under financing, under budget, especially in the German military, but across the board in Europe, I fear, but especially so in Germany. Then you have personnel. I think personnel will be the factor which will occupy us in the near future the most. So recruiting and retainment of personnel of quality will be one of the biggest challenges ahead of us, or it already is one of the biggest challenges. Then there is technological change, I would argue. So how to cope with technology, how to get a grasp on which technology will actually really influence combat in the future. And then there's the threat analysis, which is actually what has driven the article. Threat analysis, both to be able to not to confuse the imminent and present threats you face with the more remote threats, which will in fact inform your future, and at the same time to get the balance right between deterrence and defense, because deterrence and defense, and this is something which occupies us a lot in Germany here in the current situation, may demand very different things from armed forces. Mark?
Well, the only things that I would add is, well, you have emphasized already deterrence and defense. Well, speaking to my colleagues, it's currently the debate around crisis response operations, if we still need them. And you have read in our article that we make the point, yes, we do need them in the future. But at the same time, collective defense, a renewed emphasis on collective defense. And that is one of the major discussions.
It looks like we lost Mark there for a minute. Sascha, can you still hear us?
Yes, I do.
I can hear you.
It looks like Mark froze up there for a second, so we'll go back. Up now we can hear you. Yep, okay. You unfroze. Well, unfroze.
Okay,
go ahead.
The only thing that I would add, Bill, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Is that well, speaking to colleagues, crisis response operations versus collective defense? That is one of the major topics that we discuss currently now with what has happened in Ukraine. And also modern technologies, as Captain Rackwitz has already mentioned, modern technologies against more resilient older technologies, what to use best in the future. These are the discussions coming.
Yeah, I think one of the things that our editorial board, and my staff and I really liked about the article is that, you bring out a lot of these factors that are certainly playing in the discussion, the defense discussion here in the United States, right? Technology, modernization, people, force planning, whether you want to be a forward deployed or a force in being, how much emphasis do you put on, contingency operations or high-end operations versus, the sort of low-end things that you have to do. And, the German Navy has been, has played heavily in the counter-piracy operations off Somalia over the past decade, some of the Gulf of Guinea, Mediterranean types of things. There's a lot going on that's, day-to-day problems. And then there are the high-end problems, like what do we do about China? What do we do about Russia? So I wanted to ask a little bit, because you guys are certainly, so much closer to Ukraine and the current ongoing war. And our listeners know how that's playing out in American press headlines. But what are some of the daily headlines in the German press right now about the war? What kind of discussions are you having either in the MOD or in Wilhelmshaven among your German military colleagues there with the German Navy about, Russia, about the ongoing war, about that, how that impacts things like force planning? I'll start with you, Sascha.
Well, yeah, sure. It is exactly those questions, those factors. As Mark has already said, all through the last 20 to 25 years, the whole of the German armed forces, the land forces as much as the Navy, but particularly so the Navy, have been very much focused on conciliatory force operations. As you said, counter-piracy operations at the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Guinea. In recent years, counter-migration, migration control operations. And we've been off the coast of Lebanon now for almost 20 years by now, trying to uphold some stability in those very fragile, security policy-wise, very fragile areas. And now in that, actually we have we've missed the wake-up call in 2014 in many respects, and now with the Russian aggression against Ukraine this year, I fear we tip the scale in the other direction as consequently as we did for the last 20 years, which would be a mistake to say, okay, we got to stop right away with all those presence operations. We got to stop right away with all those crisis response operations. That's in the past. We made a mistake. So let's focus now on war fighting against a peer competitor. And I'd say this would be as wrong as it was wrong to totally forget about peer competitor threats in the past. And those are the discussions we're currently having. So how does that inform force structure? How does that inform technological development, and how to invest best scarce resources, most in fact, in the realm of personnel? Because technology, again, is closely connected to personnel again. What can we actually expect personnel in the future to cope with technology-wise, education-wise? Those are the questions, and it's a total difference between those conceptually force operations and what we are facing with Russia. And that's what I was talking about, the horizons, threat horizons. You named it yourself. It's not as close to us as it is to the US, but we are also thinking about China, and how will that actually change the whole picture, with Russia most probably becoming a close and, for us, very dangerous opponent, but actually a secondary opponent which is going in the wake of China. And how does that inform our relationship to the US as the biggest ally, who is more focused on China, obviously? So this is that conundrum which makes a lot of very hard decisions necessary.
Yeah, very dynamic, certainly. Go ahead, Mark, you had something to say.
Yes, the only thing that I would add is that, speaking to colleagues, I see that we have a renewed emphasis on NATO. So our allies, the United States, Europe, we came closer together. And while in the past there were at least some colleagues and maybe even presidents who put a question mark behind NATO, that seems not to be the case anymore. So we see absolutely a strengthening of NATO. And going down to the tactical level, now with, for example, the Nord Stream pipelines, and however you may think politically about this whole project, but we see that seabed projects like pipelines, internet cables, that we have to protect them better. And in the past, we as naval officers, we always have made this point, but we sense that there's more acceptance now for these issues, also for the future.
I've got one more question I'm going to ask you, and then I want to go to some of our audience questions, because we're getting quite a few good ones popping into the chat right now. But my next question is for you. You know, in your article, you start out and you point out that the most recent example of high-end warfare at sea is still the 1982 Falklands War between Great Britain and Argentina. You also quote Wayne Hughes, and anybody who quotes Wayne Hughes in a Proceedings article always gets a couple bonus points there. You draw some lessons from the Falklands War. Can you tell our listeners what some of those most important lessons are for any Navy, but especially as you look at NATO navies?
Well, I'd say, obviously, if you are an admirer of Wayne Hughes, as I am, you would always have to say all 5 or 6, depending on which edition you're talking about. Everybody talking about Falklands, it's got to be 6. But I'd argue, well, if I have to pick and choose, I would always say men matter most as a prime. And then, obviously, attacking effectively first, but then know thy technology. Because this is one of those watershed moments we're currently at with modern technology, where we see that technology which is actually not within the domain itself, in the maritime domain, is becoming more and more important, and will change, perhaps will change the whole picture. So it will be pivotal what decisions we make. Mark?
Yes, and I would say also attack effectively first, because keeping the initiative was quite important for the Falkland operation. And actually, I was one of Captain Rackwitz's students at the German Führungsakademie, our German Staff College, where he made us play the whole operation from the beginning to the end. And we realized quite quickly how difficult actually it was to lead this task group. And now reading Sandy Woodward, and I'm sure you've read his book, 100 Days.
I have not read it yet. I haven't read it yet.
I would strongly recommend, because it is a fascinating book about the issues and the problems that he faced. And one of those problems was also fatigue and the constant pressure on being vigilant, potential Argentinian attacks. I think that is still relevant today. I know that in the US Navy you have some projects how to reduce fatigue among your officers, but this is also coming as a topic in Europe. But no, I would say attack effectively first, keeping the initiative. That was quite important in the whole Falkland operation.
Good points. Yeah, let me just go to a couple of questions from the audience here. One is, can NATO keep Russia bottled up in the Baltic? So that's Harry Lime asking that question. So from your perspective there, and you're, Wilhelmshaven, you're in the, on the Baltic or close to it, and you operate, the German Navy operates there, constantly. So what do you think about the current situation in the Baltic vis-a-vis the Russian Navy?
So if I may start, Bill, I think it's a very good question. It's of course one of those questions that keep us awake and make us work quite a lot. And Captain Rackwitz will soon take over the biggest fleet, if I'm correctly informed, in the Baltic Sea, which is German Flotilla 1 in January. So in fact, yes, I think if we do it right, we can succeed. And in our article, you can see that we also say, if Nelson had drawn circles around the combined fleet, this article would be French. And if you now read a lot of articles about Kaliningrad and the kill zone circles, well, then you quite easily would say, no, we should not even give it a try if we need to. But no, I'm quite optimistic that we would have some good ideas and plans how to deal with it. Obviously, this is quite tactical now. But this is one of the big topics, obviously.
I think what we have to really, if you look at the Baltic Sea region currently, it will change dramatically with the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. You just have to see that once that happened, cross my fingers that it will be soon. Basically, 95% of the coastline of the Baltic Sea are NATO. So you have the exclave of Kaliningrad, and then you have that very small end part of that cul-de-sac, which is the Gulf of Finland, with St. Petersburg in the end. So bottling them up is not the issue.
Yep.
So the question is, I do not get the question, but it is not as it used to be until '89, where the German Navy, together with the Danes, had that biggest emphasis mission of bottling up the Russian Baltic Sea fleet, preventing them from breaking out of the Baltics and reuniting with the Northern Fleet in the North Sea. That's not the issue anymore. The issue is that we will be forced to keep up the sea lines of communication, especially to the Baltic states, which are our allies, and they are in a much more precarious situation with their land borders to Russia and Belarus. So the sea lines of communication, especially in the run-up to a possible conflict, will be essential, and they will be sea lines of communication. So the Russians don't actually have to break out; they only have to use their means in preventing us from keeping the Baltic states and Finland, perhaps in a way, closely connected to NATO and to the West to keep up their economy. It's not just about sustaining the forces there, but to sustain the population there. That's the big issue. And this, again, talking about circles and kill zones, this will be quite a tough nut to crack. And there's a lot, we haven't finished the discussions yet, how we best do that. Which role will surface vessels in a conventional understanding still playing in the Baltic Sea? Is there, and then we're coming back to technology, will the Baltic Sea in the foreseeable future become a transparent battlefield where you have to think totally different about which assets you can actually employ? Do you have to get much smaller, with much more punch on much smaller vessels, which are then outside of the Baltic Sea will be no use because they couldn't withstand the seas in the North Sea? Those are the questions of how do we balance that actually? And so the question is very pertinent, but it's not about actually bottling them in, but rather in pushing them back so that we can still reach our friends in the Baltic states and in Finland then.
You remind me of an article we published by an Estonian naval officer maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It was about how can NATO solve the geography problem in the Baltic. And when you zoom in on the Baltic Sea, as not many American naval officers do, because we don't tend to sail there a lot unless you're involved in the Baltops annual exercise. But we tend to spend, particularly the last 20 plus years, we've gone from the East Coast through across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, into the Fifth Fleet area of operations. That's been our largest focus. But when you look at the Baltic Sea nations, those new members of NATO, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, that is a distant problem for NATO, and it is it's an immediate, quick problem. It's an easier problem for Russia, right? Although right now Russia is obviously bogged down and failing miserably in Ukraine. But your point is well taken, that it's not necessarily about stopping the Russian Baltic fleet from escaping the Baltic, but really about how to protect those NATO countries that are up on the Russian border, which is a land war problem for them, but for us, it's a naval problem in the resupply, in the lines of communication. Yeah, very good point. I'm also glad you brought in Finland and Russia, or Finland and Sweden, into the problem, your answer too, because that was another question from one of our listeners. You both, in your answer to my first question, you both mentioned technology, and about how technology is one of those many important factors that has to be factored into force design, right? So what are some technologies in the German Navy, or in your conversations within NATO, that European navies are evolving, are thinking about, are focused on? Is it ships getting bigger or smaller? Is it ASW technology? Is it cyber warfare? Is it communication, C4 ISR types of, what are the big technologies that are driving change in your Navy and in NATO navies writ large?
Yes, so actually all of those that you just mentioned are quite important. Now, the most important, however, I would say, are reconnaissance and detection methods that have improved significantly over the last years. Speaking of the Falkland operation, it was still possible for the Royal Navy not to be detected when they entered the JOA, the Joint Operations Area. But nowadays, we have to assume that once we enter the JOA, we get detected quite easily by satellites and by analyzing big data, or be it personal devices by our sailors that they have with them, smartphones, that can be detected as well. So that is something that we have to keep in mind, and that kind of changes also a little bit the calculus when it comes to naval operations. And if I may say so, knowing that Captain Rackwitz has a submarine background, I think there's also a shift currently towards surface frigates when it comes to detection of submarines. We see technologies that could make a big difference in the future. Satellite communications are something that are fantastic to keep a real-time picture for the commander at home. But there's also a downside, and the downside is that commanders in the operations area get used to it. They rely on this guidance from their superior command. And just as an example, Nelson has given 3 signals in the Battle of Trafalgar to his subordinate commanders. Would that be also the case nowadays in modern combat? Hard to say, but most likely a commander back home would influence more an operation. So we see technologies with many advantages, but we also have to see the downsides, and we have to find a balance. That is what the article is about.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it's an evergreen topic in our pages, is this idea, the balance between over-the-horizon communications, the immediacy of email at sea, the ability to do video teleconferences with your higher echelon commanders, all the way back to, for the U.S. Navy, back to the Pentagon, or back to Pacific Fleet or Atlantic Fleet headquarters, and that does come with a cost, right? In our Navy, many have written about it coming at the cost of mission command, and commander's initiative at the tactical level, that people might be hesitant to make decisions because they want to know what their boss wants them to do, right? So it sounds like that's a conversation that also takes place in the German Navy and in NATO navies. It's not just the U.S. Navy.
Absolutely. And I would say actually it's many of what Mark has alluded to is space based. So it is a lot about how the military use of space, as I mentioned, which is outside, at least for Germany, outside of the realm of the Navy. But the Navy pretty much depends on it, not only for communications, but near Earth sensing, everything which has to do with that. And it will become even more important in the future, I guess. And on the other side, what we are very focused on in the German Navy, particularly, especially as the Baltic Sea is such a unique operations area, is everything which is connected to undersea warfare, everything which is connected to sea bottom warfare, especially. So if we're thinking about precise navigation without space support, without GPS, if we're thinking about high bandwidth targeting information, and surveillance information without the support of space in a contested electronic environment, we always go beneath the surface. At the same time, we see that more and more with the detection of Kelvin waves, for example, and things like this, perhaps water becomes more and more translucent. So again, the question, which role can submarines actually play in such an environment? So everything below the surface is becoming currently for us more and more important technology-wise.
Great points. So where was I going with that next one? Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. I know what I was going to say is, so, over the last, particularly after 9/11, the U.S. Navy just sort of went fast forward 110%, and we burned up the force by having a two carrier presence, and sometimes more than two carriers, often in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, and then watching as the Chinese Navy got bigger, and we wanted to counter that and have more presence in 7th Fleet. To what extent, have NATO navies also run very hard and very fast and sort of gotten behind on maintenance or gotten behind on personnel issues? Has that happened in the past 20 years in your Navy as well?
Well, obviously, I don't want to talk too much about all European navies. I don't want to get nightly calls from gentlemen from Copenhagen to Paris.
Yep.
But talking about the German Navy, absolutely so. Absolutely so. We have had a very, very high ops tempo, and have been forced, though that is not quite fair. At times, we have been very willing to provide forces into crisis management operations, those particular conceptually force kind operations which we have been talking about, because it gave forces visibility and political leverage, which promised to make a claim on funds in the future. But at the same time, it hurt preparedness, because with furnishing forces to kind of piracy and stuff, we had less and less time actually preparing the crews and going through the wake up cycles in a professional manner, and it hurt maintenance. And this is actually the harvest we're having right now, with a very, very low material and personnel preparedness, and it's very hard to climb up out of this hole again currently. So money, in fact, is not so much an issue for us. We've had the Zeitenwende that even has made American news. So with the Chancellor in early February saying, well, okay, we agree, we have to admit we made a mistake, and we have to turn around, and we have to focus more on security policy. And this led to that investment pledge of 100 billion euros in a lump sum for defense investment. So this is all very nice, but the problem is turning the whole ship around, thinking wise, and getting up standards and training and maintenance again. This will take time. It's not so easy just to invest money and there you go. So this is really a big price tag we're currently paying for. Yeah.
Mark, you're the XO on a frigate.
Yeah.
How old is your ship, and what are you seeing in terms of the challenges right on the waterfront?
Yeah, so on the tactical level, my ship is 28 years old, soon to be 30 years old, and that is some would argue that is too old for a warship. I know that actually the US Navy has been downsized over the last decades quite significantly. The same applies to a lot of European navies, be it the Royal Navy or the German Navy. And I remember having read an article about one of your undersecretaries of the army in the 70s. His name was Norman Augustine, and he has created some laws. And one of his laws was that while defense budgets grow in a linearly, the prices of aircraft, he took the example of combat aircraft, grow exponentially. And the same somehow also applies to combat ships, to warships. And we realized that even though we have now this 100 billion Zeitenwende budget increase, we are not able to create a complete new fleet around it, or create a new military around it, because things get so expensive and have gotten so expensive in the last decades. So now on the tactical level, we face the personnel problems. And if I may say so, just having spoken to an American friend, you seem to have the same problems as well, because the economy is also looking for personnel everywhere. Every bigger company is looking for personnel, and we have the same issue in Europe. So we have to find ways how to solve this issue.
But just to give you a picture, Bill, of how downsizing the fleet happened when I joined the submarine force back in 1995, we had 23 submarines. Now we are down to 6, hoping to become 8 again in the near future. So this is what happened to the German Navy, as it has to most other European navies.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you roughly how big is the German Navy, and so 6 going to 8 submarines. How about on the surface combatant side?
Well, taken all together, we will lose some ships in the future, because not every ship will now continue to be in the surface fleet. We'll get new ones quite soon, a new class multi-purpose frigates, but we will stay within with the corvettes between 25 and 30 ships, and that is not what we actually need for all those operations that we have been, and for the collective defense requirements that come from NATO now. And being one of those NATO guys that wrote the defense requirements for Germany, I know that we would need more platforms, more ships, but then again, it is quite expensive to maintain a big fleet.
Yeah, so I know a lot of ships that are sold around the world are made by German shipyards, right? And the Type 209 submarines are very popular with foreign navies, and so in the U.S. Navy we are currently talking. There's a big talk about the industrial base, and is there enough industrial base to build the size of the Navy that there's an appetite now to build. And I know a lot of our private shipyards are full to capacity. They're building ships as fast as they can, given their current capacity. How is that? How does that compare to the German industrial base for the defense sector? Are you also just at about the full capacity?
It is exactly the same picture. I'd say it's worse than with the American industrial base. I've recently spoken to industrial guys who actually said German defense industry has developed from an industry back to more of a manufacturer. Like we are building a missile at a time. We're not having industrial style scale of operations in building munitions and stuff. We are building it at a time. That stems from two factors. The one is obviously the scarcity of funds in recent years and those small numbers we actually bought ourselves in Germany. And at the same time, as you may know, that the German view on arms exports has been very conservative. So if it was up to most politicians in Germany, they would have rather seen German defense industry only exporting to other NATO or EU nations. Well, obviously, with most of those countries having their own defense industrial base, there's not much of a market to actually come up with production in scale. So this is the conundrum we are currently facing. So now, especially in the munitions area, politics in Germany is asking industry to provide and produce much more than they actually can. And they're on the same human resources problems that we face, or that everybody faces around the globe.
Yeah, that's exactly the debate that's happening here in Washington around the defense budget and the future years defense budget for the next few years is wanting to ramp up production capacity, particularly for munitions. We published a piece just last week by Nadia Shadlow, who's a strategist and who worked in the former White House. And it was, talking about energetics, about the explosives, the capacity of the U.S. defense industry to create enough explosives and propellants for missiles and pyrotechnics and that sort of thing that we just leaned out and trimmed down the size of the industrial capacity to the point where, now what's happening in Ukraine has shown us we don't have enough capacity and we need to bring it back as quickly as possible. So, well, I want to ask you, gentlemen. So with your article is really about rebalancing, NATO having to rebalance its navies, and so you're just speaking for yourselves. I know not official, defense ministry defense policy, but if NATO navies listen to you, how would NATO navies be different in 5, 10, or maybe 20 years?
If I may start here, well. That's a tough question.
Yes.
Let me give it a try. So I think when it comes to balancing out the things that we just mentioned, that would be good. So we have to be ready to conduct in the future crisis response operations. At the same time, be prepared for a collective defense scenario as well. So our navies have to keep the balance here. And I know it's more exciting to write an article portraying one extreme or the other. And our article always tries to find the balance between the extremes and the gray zone. I know this is less exciting, but we think that is more the truth than now shooting into the extremes. When it comes to our wishes, I would wish that we reduce our duplications. We have many duplications within NATO, and if we would cooperate better, delineate better, we could reduce those duplications, knowing that we all have the same problems when it comes to personnel, defense industries, etc. Defense industry cooperation is an issue, but it's highly political. So this is rather a dream than something realistic. But of course, it would help us massively if our defense industries would cooperate better.
Mark, give me an example of one of those overlaps, one of those places where there's probably too much duplication, if you will.
Yes. So I see that at least in Europe, but also I sense in the United States, there's a renewed emphasis on anti-submarine warfare, and everybody is now creating frigates and new technologies around it. But maybe we are overshooting a little bit when it comes to certain areas, knowing that, for example, Russia doesn't have many submarines in the Baltics. Nevertheless, we invest much money, not only Germany, but also other countries that are around the Baltic Sea, in anti-submarine warfare. So it is important, don't get me wrong, but it's about getting the balance right again. And air defense frigates, Royal Navy, German Navy, the Marine Nationale in France, we are all investing massively. So maybe the right answer are multi-purpose, multi-mission ships. And we see also this trend coming up in Europe and also in the United States to have modular combatants in the future.
Sascha,
any
thoughts?
Yeah, I would add some thoughts, which would be, so how would they look? They would be ships or force structures which are made possible with much less personnel. So this has to be a driving factor. It doesn't make any sense to come up with the brightest ideas about the best anti-missile or what have you, ballistic missile defense systems or what have you, if you do not find the personnel to actually man those systems. So we have to come up with ways of having multi-mission ships which are at the same time carrying the punch they need, but only do that with the smallest crew you can actually come up with. We've had the discussions for years and years about lean management, manning and optimal manning. And I know about all the downsides of that, and that you need certain crew sizes to actually fight the ship in the internal battle, for example. But we have to come up or face the fact that those crews are not to be had. And so we can rethink our force structures with respect to staying power of our vessels, make them perhaps smaller with less staying power, with less endurance, because we in the end know if we build them bigger and stronger and more endurable, well, we won't find the crews to do that. So we can get away with that and do it smaller, do it easier, and perhaps a little dumb it down. Because in the end, what the biggest advantage of navies always was as a political instrument is its versatility. So it doesn't help us to build those galactic Death Stars, which are only capable of doing one thing: fight the Russians or fight the Chinese, which then in the end can be really manned and are no purpose for any other, have no utility in any other kind of war. We did that for 20 years. We ventured on that road, in the German Navy at least. Don't make that mistake again now in a different direction.
Great point. So have you guys received any feedback on your article among your colleagues in German Navy or perhaps NATO friends?
So yes, from NATO friends, as well as from colleagues. So when it comes to NATO friends, they were actually quite happy because they see the same issues that we portray in the article as the major issues as well. When it comes to colleagues here on the tactical level that I serve on, it's of course they would now argue that we should get rid of the crisis response operations. We should now only focus on collective defense. This is what we have been built for. This is what we want to do. High intensity warfare. But yeah, so the feedback, I think overall was quite positive. But of course, it is a current discussion where to find the balance.
I'm glad you've gotten some feedback. Has it been translated into German?
Well, we've translated it. It hasn't been published yet. So we have been waiting with a publication. But yes, there is a German version by now. It has been originally written, the first draft I'd written and then discussed with Mark and then forged that collaboration was in English, because believe it or not, for us it's much easier to write such an article in English than in German, because the whole structure of thought,
of course,
vocabulary is all English. So it was quite an effort actually to translate it into German, and there will be a publication, I think in January most probably, in, so to say, the colleague of Proceedings in Germany, which is the Marine Forum, which is the monthly publication or bi-monthly publication of the German Navy Officers Association. Yes.
Fantastic. Well, when it's published, please send us a link to it.
We do.
Okay, that would be great. That'd be great. So we got to wrap up here. We're about out of time. Any last comments from either of you? Anything that we didn't cover that we should have mentioned?
No, happy that it was a great honor and a lot of fun in collaborating with you, and looking forward to more collaboration in the future.
Well, my staff and I and our editorial board, we're very much looking forward to the next article you write for us, because this one was just terrific. It's a great piece, and it was nice to get a couple of NATO officers' views on these force structure discussions and arguments and the factors that are playing in, not just in the U.S. Navy, but in all our navies, as we think about the future. Very insightful, very, very good piece. And, please do write for us again.
Will be a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Bill.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast, brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield Dental Coverage. I can't help myself from smiling right now. That's because I have Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP Dental. I pay no deductible for in-network services. My in-network preventive care is fully covered, including 3 cleanings a year. Plans start as low as $20 a month. Learn more at bcbsfepdental.com. Okay, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast. If you like the show, if you enjoy the show, like us, subscribe to the channel, tell your friends, become a member of the Naval Institute at usni.org/join. Until next week, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.